Hey, welcome everybody to AI News and Gurus, the show for intelligent distributors. My name is Brian Hopkins, and I'm here with my good friend and co-host Brooks Hamilton. And we've got a very special show for you today, and I'm really excited to talk to you about what's going to happen. But before, let me tell you a little bit about our upcoming conference. This is the Profit and Productivity Summit for Distributors. This is how you're going to drive profit and productivity across the entire enterprise, ranging from everything from pricing to order automation to improving working capital and really using data to drive decisions in Salesforce work and workforce productivity. We already have a great speaker lineup, and we're just continuing to add to it. And we've got John Weiborg, the CEO of Stellar Industrial, Alex Jashowski, who's going to be talking to us about the economic situation currently and how you can begin to thrive good times and in bad. So we're looking forward to having him. And on top of that, one of the smartest people I've ever met in distribution, Janet Zelinka, will be with us. She's the former CFO and CIO at Stericycle and Ascendant. And we got a bunch more coming soon that we'll be announcing very, very soon. So go to profitandproductivity.com to get more information and register today. The other thing I want to tell you about is our new suite of software called Distributor RX. And there's really three different components to it that will help a distributor in a lot of different ways. The first one is customer experience, which is really a customer survey software built on the Net Promoter Score that is designed specifically for distributors. So rather than just get the overall score, which a lot of systems give you, it tells you exactly where you need to improve so that you can figure out ways to improve your customer experience, which is becoming more and more important in the ways that distributors differentiate themselves. The Employee Experience RX is designed exactly the same way, the exact same platform, but that really helps you pinpoint exactly what you need to improve within your employee experience, because talent is really hard to come by, and keeping that talent's even harder. So using this system will allow you to continue to get better every single day. And then the last piece of this is Demand RX. Now, this helps you understand and really pinpoint the potential that exists in an account and by prospects, by category in your individual market. So it's using a combination of your data and an external data to give you a really clear picture on where you can go drive sales today. So if you're interested in seeing more of this, go to our website, distributionstrategy.com, click on software, and we'll get a demo set for you immediately. And as I said, we've got a really, really good show for today. We're gonna recap the Applied for AI for Distributors show that happened literally a month ago today. So Brooks will be joining us, and I'm really happy to have my good friend and happens to be my boss, Ian Heller. So guys, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you guys. And for the audience, a little perspective. I joined I joined the company a year ago, and the first one I did of this in 2022, I was there as a distributor. So I got to see a lot of the kind of deer in the headlights, and I know I was in that spot. And then last year, as a member of DSG, I got to see the evolution of the audience, where AI became, okay, I know what to do with it. I'm starting to work on it, and we've got to do something about it. So this year, I had a family commitment, and Ian honored that, and I didn't get to go to the show. So I got to do a lot of the planning, but I didn't get to see the show itself. So what I'm really excited about is Brooks and Ian joining us to kind of talk about their perspective in a lot of different ways. So guys, welcome to the show, and let's get started.
Hey, Brian. Let's do
Nice
this
to
thing.
see you, my friend. How are you?
Great, great. I wasn't really sure which point I should jump in on, so it was a little hopscotch on my part there. Apologies.
It's all
I'm
good.
excited
It's all
about this.
good.
I thought
Yeah, me
you
too.
I thought you abandoned us, Brooks.
He did. He's up in the woods and he's abandoning us. That's fine. No problem. And welcome, Ian. You're in your
Thank you
familiar
for having
background,
me.
but not in your familiar spot, right? And I get to ask you these questions this time.
I know. Well, I think you guys made a mistake because this is AI News and Gurus, and you invited me instead. I think it should be AI News and Yahoo's.
Give yourself a little
Already
credit.
considering that move based on user feedback.
That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, hey guys, let's jump in, right? Because I think the audience, like me, a lot of them didn't get to attend the show, and next year's show, if you hadn't been there this year, you better make sure you're there next.
Yeah.
So let's just get your kind of overall take, right? So Ian, I'll start with you. You know, what was your overall opinion of the show? What you thought? What'd you think of it?
Well, it's really interesting to talk about this show in the context of the two previous shows, right? So
Yeah.
the first one was in 2023, and the crowd was kind of deer in the headlights. And remember, the people who show up to these shows, our shows, are very technology forward by comparison to the average in the industry, right? And that's not an insult on the industry. It's just that if you're taking time and money to go to an AI show, you're more progressive on average than people who don't do that. And so 2 years ago, people were like starry eyed and wow, yeah, it's amazing. Look, it wrote a poem and, stuff like that. And there were some solutions. We probably had a couple dozen sponsors 2 years ago.
Mhm.
But a lot of them were incumbent company, existing software suppliers like ERP companies and others who were adding AI to what they did, along with some newer companies. This year, the crowd was a much larger crowd, but we had 41 software companies there.
That's
Uh,
amazing.
some of which
That's
I'd
amazing.
never heard of until they called us about the show, right? And the audience was serious about, nobody was starry-eyed anymore. This discussion was, okay, what do I need to do to create competitive advantage with AI enabled technology?
Mhm.
So and some of the hotspots were quote to order automation. We had, five, so more than 10% of the sponsors were quote to order and or order a quote and automation, right? So you send
Yeah.
a handwritten note or a spreadsheet or whatever, and the software automatically matches it over to your products and sends it back out. I mean, it's pretty amazing technology. It's very clear to me that's going to be table stakes. If you don't have
Yeah.
that, you're going to start losing more quotes than ever because your competitors are all going to be turning around massive, much higher percentage of the quotes that they receive than ever before, and they're going to be doing it faster than ever before. I mean, you better do that. You better have that soon.
That's the initial one. Yeah. I
Right.
remember trying to do this 5 years ago and it was impossible. It was manual. It was
Yeah.
hard to get people to adopt to it. And now the technology is such that you're right. You have to have this. It's
Well, you used
crazy.
to triage your inbound quotes, right?
Oh yeah.
I'll respond to this with some criteria. I'll respond to these. I'll get to these if I have time and before the due date. I'm not going to respond to these at all. Now these companies are going to respond to all of them. I mean,
Like
unless
that.
they really don't meet some criteria.
Yeah.
I think.
Being on
Go
the
ahead,
other
Brooks.
being on the other side of that during the implementation times, we would sell these implementations kind of on the, hey, you can have better margins based on these replies. At one point, an executive sponsor kind of took me aside and said, listen, pricing and margin is nice, but what we see is like, if we're able to turn these things around faster, our win rate goes up just because we're
Yeah.
the first one back. And that win rate move, that's big for us. So thanks for the additional margin, but we got additional revenue as well. So yeah, I if that becomes table stakes, it is going to be hard competing in that market.
So what did you think, Brooks? Ian mentioned that evolution of deer in the headlights to action. What was from your perspective? What did you notice and see?
The Without a doubt, first year was, what is AI? What am I even going to do? Very forward-looking people. Second year
You can't your mute
was,
button, buddy.
No, I can hear.
yep. So the second year was, um, I'm interested in exploring and running a pilot, maybe.
Yeah.
This year was, we are doing things. We already have a couple of pilots, or we're about to start a pilot, and we're now looking for solutions to go execute against our vision of what we want to go do. Massive difference from 2 years ago.
Yeah, no doubt. We have one of our audience members talk about there are 3 product information companies there, which is really unique. You know, I don't remember that being there, any one being there the previous 2 years. So it's an interesting thing that now the data is becoming, you know, such a big part of this.
In terms of presentations, I thought that those from the PIM and data enrichment organizations were some of the most interesting and compelling that I saw during the conference.
Yeah.
I was really impressed by the level of innovation from a number of those organizations about not just, hey, we're going to manage this, but we're going to execute some of the tasks that people have had to, execute in terms of drudgery, that they're now doing automatically. I was very impressed with that category. And that I agree, like that came out of left field. One other thing that I'm not sure that it was reflected in the vendors yet, but maybe that we'll see in future conferences is the SEO, GEO kind of what is e-commerce going to be like as we move into a world where language models are doing a fair amount of the searching for products. And the example for us is our last 2 inbound leads came from OpenAI. And what I mean by that is somebody was looking at a roadmap project. They searched, hey, what companies support this type of work? We came up among a list and they reached out. I was shocked. I hadn't anticipated that it was going to come that fast. I thought that was a year or 2 down the road. So that really has snapped my head around on how do we need to start rethinking that portion of it. So I'm sure we'll see some vendors emerge in that space as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I use large language models pretty extensively in a lot of ways, right? Not just in work life, but in my personal life. I rarely go to Google anymore, rarely, just because Perplexity is so much better, right? It does a better job of culling down the information and giving you what you need. So, and as more and more of these models become more similar and they have more features that are a lot the same, they're getting closer to that. They're all going to have that deep research, web-based, answer-based. So being able to show up there is just as important now as, you know, the SEO days of the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Just a little news nugget. Google has reported 15% drop in subsequent traffic. They're attributing the larger percentage of that to their better search results. So if you get an answer in Google, blah, blah, but if you also notice they're beginning to struggle on the revenue side. And if you look at Google searches and their associated, if you go to a website, you'll kind of notice that there's more and more advertising per screen. That is something that Google does influence. And I think they're pulling a lot of revenue levers right now that kind of indicate they're going through they're beginning the struggle. So yes, I think as people increasingly shift over to use language models and other tools, less of that inbound traffic is going to come directly from Google, and it may come more from other spaces.
Yeah, one of the things I heard, it was on another podcast, but they were talking about this show, and they were talking about that idea that engine optimization for AI is important, is that these agentic AI agents, if they don't find what they need right away from your website, they're not going to pick up the phone and call a sales rep. Right? They're just going to move on to the next website where they can find the right information. So that's a huge change in how digital leaders kind of think about, how do I make sure my website is capable of handling these, these inquiries?
Yeah, I think that'll be a hit. The conference, one of the big pieces to me, which was fascinating about the conference, was the opening that Jonathan and Ian gave, where he gave a survey of here's where we expect the different technologies to begin to come in and play. And I thought that was a wonderful information cycle. But one of the big nuggets there was he had shared a perspective on what do we expect for both labor savings as well as integration of various capabilities as the years click on, and provided a current perspective of, in customer service, perhaps there's a 20% labor savings within a 2-year time frame. In warehousing, perhaps 15% prior to robotics playing a role. Um, Finance might be up to 20% depending upon the amount of procured kind of AP and AR reconciliation that's going on. So I thought that was a really valuable portion of the conference, and one to kind of track during each of the conferences to see how these capabilities are becoming more common as well as more capable as these quarters click by. So, Ian, if I can make any request to Jonathan there, I would say love it. Love to see it again. Love to see it updated. I thought that was really powerful because it helps everybody begin to plan around what's available, what's typical, and what do I need to start looking into in order to stay competitive.
Yeah. So Ian, you have seen the evolution of this industry, right? I mean, I'm not calling you old or anything, so don't take it that way. But you've seen it, right? You've seen how we've changed and ebbed and flowed over the course of the year. So now taking that, and you hear Jonathan talk about the next 5 years, what are the key things that you think distributors should take from that, right? Maybe those who weren't in the room say, hey, the next 5 years, you better be doing X.
I think they ought to do that ROI calculator that you put together with Claude
No.
and pro forma stuff in their business. Have you shown that on this show before?
I have not, but I think we need to, because it's
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And so for those of you who haven't seen it, which is probably everybody, Brian put together this calculator in Claude, and it's basically this interface. And we'll just bring it up if you have it. And I mean, it helps you figure out like what is the impact of AI enabled technologies on a distribution company, right? So you bring some information about your company, different costs for how much does a sales rep cost, an inside sales rep cost, et cetera. How, what's your revenue, a bunch of other just data that you have about your company. You plug it into the model. And then Brian has put together this mind blowing pro forma generator. I mean, it's incredible. And he did it with LLMs. That's why when I say Brian is the most advanced user of LLMs I know, I mean it. I mean, he just knows how to use these tools. He's incredible. And this helps you understand like what are the capital costs for this stuff? What's the ongoing expense? What's the benefit you're going to get? And then it knits them all together. So what's the value of a AI enabled CRM? There it is. So why don't you walk through it, Brian? It's your work, but
Yeah, I mean, you're doing a pretty good job of it, but essentially what it's doing is it's saying, based on a $500 million company, right here, they're about the amount of employees that you have in each one of these given roles, allows you to change that based upon the individual company. But then what it'll do is to say, hey, if I put in an AI enhanced CRM in the first year and it cost me $150,000 to do it, and another $75,000 every year to maintain that subscription, and it's going to get me 5% sales growth, and I'll only do that one.
Right, but go through all the different options just so people can see what you put. But I mean, even
so it's AI CRM, it's warehouse management, right? The one that I think it's overlooked a lot is inventory forecasting and demand. AI does an amazing job with this, but people have got to pay attention to that. But it's got AI route optimization and things in the warehouse automation that you couldn't put in place, and then things internally, whether that's your e-commerce site, whether that's your PIM, put an advanced analytics platform, and then anything in customer service, and then some things around AR and AP, and then things in the back office, right? So it's trying to touch each one of the different areas of the business where AI is going to make a difference over time. All right, so if I were to do that and I were to do AR and AP in year 2, it cost me $100,000 to put it in. And again, 75,000.
I think you have, yeah, there you go. You had a million in there. So good.
Million, even if it's a million. What then it'll allow you to do is then put and say, how much automation do you expect with that technology? Right. So with sales, maybe it's 5 in the first year, it's 10 in the second. And it's 20 here, and all of a sudden your FTE now is 85. Right. And same thing with customer service, you're going to get 25% automation. And then back office, let's say you get 10 this year. And you get 10 next year. And it will tell you exactly what you should expect from a savings perspective over the course of those 5 years. And it allows you to put in pricing optimization, right? So if you use any of the tools like a pros or any of the pricing automation tools in there, allows you to say how much you expect to get back from that. And then at some point, if you're doing all this automation and you're ahead of your competitors and you say, I want to go take some market share, I'm going to strategically reduce some prices in year 4 and year 5, right? Because I'm saving all this money through automation. And now what it's going to do is give you an idea about what that looks like. What are the metrics that tell you exactly what you're going to get over the course of the years, right? Either labor savings, your implementation, your ongoing costs. So doing all of those things, and that's a relatively, small piece of automation for a company that size. It's a $24 million plus cash flow.
Yeah, right. So, and look, obviously, there's a lot of error in the forecast, but at least you have one, and you can compare, compare the outcomes of different choices. And I think this blows me away. I mean, what a great tool to have, for companies that are trying to figure out what they're going to get from implementing AI enabled technologies.
So yeah, that's the tool itself, and we'll be moving that out relatively soon. But it's a way to give distributors an idea about what's the impact going to be. What can it really be besides some of the flowery languages?
I have a few comments on this. One, I think this is excellent. It is very well done. 2, I would prefer to use this over Excel gobbledygook any day of the week.
Right.
And the third is, Brian, would you mind talking about what your technical background is?
My technical background,
I think, might be the biggest thing.
Yeah. It literally exists of me bugging the crap out of the IT guys every time I had this bright idea to have, help me do this. So it literally is, in terms of coding and all that, zero. I started with zero. And what I started with, it was the idea that this is what I wanted to create, and I know how to use the large language models to ask it for the right thing.
And you knew what your objective was, and what your objective should look like as you were iterating through this. But what you're saying is you had no coding experience, no development experience coming into this. No languages, technical languages, but you were able to get something which I would say is a total A+ product out there, and you did it yourself, which I think is total validation of Ian's perspective of Brian's one of the best language model users out there. But there isn't anything totally special about the tool. There are obviously many special things about Brian, but it might be that software development might not be one of them.
Yeah. Well, imagine if you had a handful of people in your company who learned how to use LLMs the way that Brian does and what they could help you figure out. I mean, all the analytics questions that are so hard for you today, things around, customer lifecycle and churn and inventory management and employee issue. I mean, you could just create these tools that would do these extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And and the people who have the idea are doing the programming, like Brian did, because
And I'll tell you what I don't take any credit for was the UI of that thing. If I were to show you, I probably have to go dig it up, but I started this project early May. In the first UI of this thing looks radically different than the one you just saw. And I never asked the AI tool to be better at it. Not once.
But
Through that iteration process, it just got better.
But it became better. And
yeah,
I think, you know, AI brings a lot of things to the table, but I think something that people bring to the table that's very valuable is vision and taste. So this, you have the vision for this is the project I want to go do, and taste in terms of this is how it should be put together. This is what it should look. This is its interaction. And I think this takes us back to the first keynote from Trent Gillespie when he talked about his big trends. So he talked about, hey, there are lots of opportunities for predictive analytics, optimization of the supply chain, route planning, and over time. But the great other piece that he pointed out was, listen, there's a ton of opportunity of what you can go do for under $500. And I think this is a great example of it. And also there are a whole other set of activities or projects to go engage in under $100,000. I think he listed like, hey, you know, pulling in and vectorizing catalogs, creating analytical apps. And this to me is a great example of some of those trends that Trent was talking about.
Yeah, and I try to tell people we're doing these AI workshops for executives for a couple of different companies over the next few months. And one of the things I try to tell people is the reason that these large language models are important for people to understand is not so they can use it as Google and ask it funny questions about, you know, what's that star in the sky kind of stuff, but is really to understand the basis of how AI can help you in the business. Now, you had mentioned the idea of, I don't know how to code, of course, but I've been in distribution long enough to know what good looks like. And I think a lot of people are in that spot, right? We're in a spot where the Gen X group knows a lot about distribution. So learning a lot about AI, especially these large language models, helps them because now all of a sudden you're combining the 20 plus years of experience with these new tools. That's where that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, there's some really neat applications there to generate up. And what I got kind of the feel from the show in terms of pilots, you know, especially as the great presentation from the leader from Sonopar was, hey, we're running kind of 2 levels, maybe even 3 levels of pilots and experiments. One is at the individual level, which they've done in terms of Copilot, but they're saying, hey, it's not just about Copilot use. Let's also see like what little projects and what improvements can you make at an individual or departmental level to go faster. Then he talked about the departmental level projects where I think there were a lot of really good vendors that were there for. And then the more enterprise activity of here are the ways we need to think about policy, usage, governance, how this is consistent with culture and the overall business objectives. That really means that, hey, we need to be thinking about this not just at a departmental level, but an individual level, like you just demonstrated, Brian, and that enterprise level of how do we go about thinking about this and rolling it out and ensuring that the right limiters and governance are in place. But that I thought was a fantastic presentation. And of all of the feedback that I received afterwards, I think that was the one where people said, wow, that is an excellent perspective on how an AI rollout should look within a larger organization and what pieces of that can I take in order to apply at mine. And the biggest one I heard was, I need to run more pilots and I need to unlock more value and understanding at that individual level. So people kind of
Yeah.
get it and then work towards those departmental objectives as they get creative there. So
Yeah.
that was an excellent presentation.
Yeah, I didn't see it, obviously. I would love to see it. But what I think is that obviously they have a clear strategy in what they want. And to me, that's that moves somebody from, I want to do all these pilots to, I've got a clear strategy. How do I implement? Because now you're building that muscle at the individual level. So you're, again, combining that knowledge of the industry with, muscle memory of how AI works to create that. So you could, as a small to medium-sized distributor, do exactly what Sonapar's doing. And you can use a large language model to help you figure out how to do it. So by using that, but knowing how to use the large language model, asking it to help you build that cohesive strategy, right? You don't have to be a, multi-billion dollar company to pull that off. You can do that at any level.
Yeah. The best internally produced, non-consultant added roadmap was from the smallest prospect that we've worked with. We looked at it, we were like, whew, this is good work. And we asked them, how did y'all come up with this? They're like, this is nice. And they said, oh, we just played around with the language model for a while. We kind of knew what we wanted to do. We don't know if these are the right things. I think they could make excellent use, like with your ROI calculator, Brian, but they built the whole thing themselves. So I thought that was a great example of, here's how I can use the tool to be better at the tool.
I have a question for you
Yeah.
guys. So a big theme in the conference was agentic is next, and it's going to be big, right? So we had a couple people speak on that. Do you think agentic AI will make a bigger impact than LLMs in the long run?
I've got maybe a little bit of a controversial take on that, which is, I don't know if the value that was initially sketched out with agents in terms of how they will be used is coming to bear. And what I see is agents are capable of executing tasks in the 2 to 10 minute range of what it would take a person to do, but really struggling if there are not significant supports to move up that value chain. So the technology industry will learn what those supports are that are necessary. But there's some struggle going on there right now. I think one of the items that I believe it was that Trent Gillespie, was every buyer and every seller are likely going to have a agent or model or whatnot that is tuned to their preferences. I think that is very real. And it is going to probably look like a combination of language model plus some agentic capabilities, like some tool use. But I think that is very likely to have dynamic implications within like how we execute sales today. I do think there's going to be more information both at the operational level as well as the commercial level. But if it's coming through agents, maybe. I think it's going to be something more akin to assistants that understand your context and have some tool usage. And maybe there are like little action steps that are associated with those tools.
Yeah, I kind of think in the short term, no. In the longer term, yes. Right. And again, it depends on the business type, right? Because there's so many unique things distributors put in to help customers that agents aren't going to be able to get that all the way through. The pink bow around the pallet before it goes out on Wednesdays, maybe not get there. But if it's a MRO business that's highly pretty regimented and routine, I think the agents are going to do a great job with that. But then goes back to, I think Zach Cass talks a lot about this, is the human going to get in the way? Is the human going to have a level of trust with the agents to say, go for it? I'm going to unleash this thing and let it go. I feel like it's going to take us a while to get to that point.
Yeah, Brian, you remember when we saw Zach speak recently at the Convenience Distributors Association?
Yeah.
And one of the things he talked about was we have very high tolerance for human error and very low tolerance for technology error, right? So one Tesla crashes and automated cars are terrible. Meanwhile, 35,000 people a year die from human error, right? and he's right, right? And by the way, so I'm going to answer my own question since you guys both went. I think it's going to be bigger. In fact, right as I asked that question, somebody weighed in on the Q&A and said 100%. But that person is an anonymous attendee, so it could have been me. But I tell you, it was not me. It was not me. So I have at least one ally out there. But yeah, I think, and here's what I think is going to. I think there are two things that are going to drive it in the long run. And I'm a non-technologist, as you know, so this is just my view. One is when AI becomes recursive. Okay, in other words, self-improving, and it's not relying on humans. The subsequent releases of ChatGPT are designed by ChatGPT, and I just think that improvement line is going to go like that, and we're not ready for that. We can't even adapt to the current level of AI improvement. We're all going to be left in the dust when that skyrockets. And the second thing, maybe, is quantum computing, which is I'm not sure how that affects AI because quantum computers aren't better in every way over conventional computers, just in some ways. But it just feels to me like you start bringing those together, and there's not going to be much that agents can't do better than humans, and that's a huge employment concern, like we've talked about before. But
yeah, well,
anyway,
it's funny you say that because Sam Altman literally said yesterday, it was yesterday, the day before, he legitimately is probably one of the smartest humans on the planet.
Yeah,
there was a question that he didn't know, and he asked ChatGPT 5, and it answered it immediately. So your point about better, faster, smarter, more quickly,
yeah,
that's coming faster than I think we realize. All right,
RP agrees with me too, by the way, Brian.
Well, RP agreed. If I asked him really, he would agree with me, but that's okay.
No, that's not true.
I gave him a great prompt this morning, so I'm back on his good side today.
Okay.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the idea of what happens when all this automation goes on. So you've got a group of CSRs and a group of salespeople. Now they're a part of their job's automated. Now what?
I think a really interesting question is which parts and how are enterprises beginning to change the way that they see sales technology and sales tools. To opine a little bit, I think Salesforce did a terrific job of building a high value company and a terrible job of trying to force that model onto all industries. So I think that caused a lot of organizations to say, no, I don't want CRM in my company because it's not a net add to my salespeople. My salespeople are valuable. I don't want to do this. Whereas now I think we're beginning to see a little bit of a shift of that perspective, where if some sales activities can be automated, is it the selling part and relationship part that's getting automated, or is it the support for people on other more mundane tasks, and instead allowing them to spend more time on that selling and preparation and relationship building? how and as a result, I think this is really beginning to shake up the perspective of what is a CRM and what tools do I want to provide to my sales force. And I think we saw that reflected in some of the messaging of the CRM vendors at the show. Some of them were talking about, here's CRM, it's specific to distribution. Others are talking about it in terms of, we don't know that we want to be thought of as CRM anymore, even though we're here working with sales reps in a similar way. So the tool sets that I think are being considered for the field or outside sales reps are now a little different from the more efficiency gaining solutions that we see today for the ISRs and CSRs. What are y'all's perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the sales front, right? There's so much information that the enterprise has in its system somewhere, and the CRMs are bringing it out to put in front of sales reps to say, here's what this customer is, here's what they buy, here's how they buy it, here's how often, all the things these modern CRMs are giving to people. Here's the insights. So I agree with that portion of it. Where it gets tricky to me is on the CSR front, because the common thought was, hey, I'm going to save 20 CSRs by automating. So, and then you say, okay, well, what do you do with those 20? Well, in a lot of companies, they've been employees for 10 or 15 years. They're like family members. It's real easy from a distance to say, well, let's just get rid of those 20. That doesn't always happen. Where it gets tricky for me is those 20 may not be good at selling. And what support do you have for them as an organization to try to help them make that transformation? That's where, to me, where it gets a little dicey. And I think distributors are going to wrestle with that for quite a bit of time to figure out, well, I've got this productivity, now what do I do with it?
I think it's going to become, I think they're going to get over it. I don't mean this in a cold-blooded way, because I don't like this, but I think losing your job to AI is going to get normalized. And after a while, it's just going to be, it's going to change. People are going to have different expectations about their ability to keep their job in an increasingly automated world. And it will just become the thing that happens. And that'll make it easier for companies to lay people off. People are going to expect it. I don't like it, but I got to tell you, everybody says, hey, we're not going to lay people off. We're just going to reduce headcount by attrition as we grow. Attrition, in order for there to be attrition, some of those people leaving have to get jobs somewhere else. That's part of what drives attrition, is people find other opportunities. If many companies are attriting at the same time, there's nowhere for the people to go, right? I mean, if everybody is automating and the net number of jobs is declining, then people aren't going to leave. They're not going to quit because they can't find a job somewhere else, and you're going to want to lay them off instead. I mean, I just think
it's also not
Go ahead, Briggs.
It's not it's not like, hey, sales are down 10%, so we're going to have to lay 10% of the workforce off, and it's going to impact all departments. Instead, it is, these are the narrow roles and tasks which are going to get automated, and it's going to happen pretty much industry-wide. And it's going to happen over a relatively short time period. Even if it was 5 or 10 years, that is a short time period to drive that level of automation in specific roles. So people may not just be leaving this role and hopefully get another CSR role somewhere. If this is happening where there are 10,000 or 100,000 people coming onto the market in a specific skill set all at the same time. So
yeah,
Ian,
I mean, I think it's
agree.
much more prevalent in kind of the transactional world, right? In the AR and the AP, where the systems will get good enough to be able to match that. I think people will be okay with agents in that perspective.
Well, a lot of big companies they've already outsourced that work to India.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
a
fair.
lot of big distributors, they aren't doing their AR and AP in the United States anymore. They've outsourced that to overseas teams, and you know, th those aren't people who've been there 15 years that you're going to worry about, hurting the culture when you let them go. I, I
Right.
I'm not I'm not inhuman. I'm just saying this
No,
is
you've been a realist about this from the beginning, and
yeah,
it's been true. It's been playing itself out, and
yeah,
it's going to continue. Which I guess goes back to you shouldn't be waiting on any of this,
right.
right? Because if I think Scott Wagner said it yesterday on the show, he said the whole idea of you're going to lose your job to AI, somebody using AI deal, you're going to lose your job because your competitor using AI and it's better than you.
Yeah,
And
if
the
you don't adopt
company,
this stuff as a distributor, you're not going to be employing anybody pretty soon.
yeah, it's tough to say, but that's the reality that we live in. All right. So what else about the show? Like what we talked about Trent, we talked a little about Sonopar. How about anything else from the speakers that kind of hit you guys?
Well,
Maybe.
Will Quinn weighed in just now with a comment on the previous discussion. We should probably wrap. I just saw it.
All right. What did Mr. Quinn say?
He says, at some
That's
point,
some,
companies are going to hit a wall. You can't keep laying people off and expect demand to stay strong. If too many
yeah.
folks are out of work or barely getting by, who's left to buy your products or services? No income means no spending, and that's bad news for everyone, including the ones doing the cutting. I totally agree, but no individual firm can solve that problem. That's a societal problem. He's 100% right. And
Yeah.
I don't think we've got the political will to solve that problem, by the way. I mean, despite the great, collaboration we see in Washington these days, I don't think the two parties are going to get together on this. So,
Yeah,
Yeah. That could be
it's
its
a
own show in
societal
of it.
it's a
Is
societal level issue,
yeah,
which individual companies are not optimizing for societal level issues. We're optimizing for
right.
our 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 own revenue growth.
right. So anyway, what are you
Yeah.
going to say, Brian? I didn't mean to cut you off.
I mean, that's probably it's a show in and of itself, right? I mean, it's the shift that we're making. We're in a new industrial revolution. We're in a brand new one, and it's every time this has happened, it displaced things, and this is going to displace it at an even bigger pace. So it's a really complex subject for people a heck of a lot smarter than me. All
I
right,
want
we
to talk
got a
about
couple of minutes. Go ahead, Brooks.
just a couple of notes. One of the closer to the end speakers was Noelle Russell,
Oh,
who she led the Alexa team at Amazon. I thought her work was really thought provoking. Like one was her perspective on return of what she would expect from sales oriented and inventory optimization oriented projects was about a 1 to 4. So, they expect a pretty substantial return on that investment, and they're working with projects and companies that were at the tens to hundreds of millions of dollar investments. So I took that as once again a signal that where there are budgets available, they are getting refocused on some of these projects, and they are seeing some substantial returns. That there was a news article floating around a while back that companies are killing off a lot of AI projects. Things hadn't panned out. Well, if you actually go in and read the real study on that, it was simply that the pilots, of which they would usually experiment with like 5 programs or 5 pilots, they would select the best one, put a lot of money behind that, maybe put a little money behind the second one and kill the other 3 off, which that's what you do when you experiment.
Yeah.
Uh,
right.
but instead it's being talked about as, hey, these projects are not not executing and providing returns. That's not accurate. And we aren't going to see people spending $100 million on projects again and again that don't have ROIs or haven't proven ROIs at smaller scales. So I do think that we're going to continue to see pretty rapid and substantial investment in this area. And as you know, I worked in the tech industry for quite some time, and what I'm hearing from others is, "Hey, our project got killed. We were on the goal line, and our XYZ projects is pulled." Well, the reason it was pulled was those funds are getting reallocated to AI projects. For better or for worse, that is what is happening out there. And so many tech organizations are trying to figure out how to reorient to that new reality.
Yeah, and I think people have to, especially you talk about the pilots and being, iterating, and I think people have to be comfortable with AI is not perfect out of the gate. It's never going to be perfect out of the gate. You're going to put it in. It's going to do some funky things. It's going to train. It's going to learn. But you can't expect it to be like one of the old technologies that you put it in, turned it on, it worked perfectly, and everybody was happy, and you went on your business. This is an iterative process, so you have to be able to be willing to let it learn a little bit and learn about what you do. So it's a mindset shift that I think people have to make.
But I think that also speaks to then where do you make those initial investments where you have AI interacting? What that points me to is I'm probably not willing to expose this to higher risk demographics like a prospective customer base. Instead, I want to work with internal resources to make sure that this is going well enough before launching it out into the wild. But the use cases that they're talking about, Noel was talking about in terms of large investment areas are customer intelligence, recommendations, business process optimization, which I think we saw a lot of at the show, but also some in terms of intelligent search, and then things I haven't heard of as much in terms of gaining traction, like predictive maintenance, resource optimization, HR optimization, which I think we will begin to see more of. But those are the big investment areas right now. And so I her perspective on that. No, once again, Valley.
I gave a little bit of time here. We're up against the hour, and I want to get one or two things that you guys say, the distributors, you should be doing this right now, this quarter. Ian, what's your perspective on that one?
Order automation, CRM, inventory. Am I answering the right question?
Totally answering the right question.
Okay. All right. Your expression made me think, oh, maybe I was.
No, you're good.
Yeah. I think those are the three. I mean, and pricing. Those are the four.
Yeah. Pricing seems to be an easy one.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, I'm answering off the top of my head, not from someone else.
Personally, I think, the idea of that we used to keep scoreboards up in a branch location, who could take the most orders and who could put in the most information in the system. And that used to be the person you give the trophy to every week. I think that's where you target this. You should start order and quote automation right now. To your point earlier, more companies are going to put this in because it gives you such a fast return. It gives you automation more quickly. That if you're not doing it, your competitor is, and you're going to lose. I think you can do that right now. The companies that are out there do it right now, and they do it really well. What do you think, Brooks? Bring us home.
Yeah, I think that's that to me feels like, yes, gotta go do that. Second one is there's a giant, great deal to be had, which is if you can improve individual productivity 20% for $30 a month, I don't know what other solution you can get that pays that kind of ROI, period. but I see very little consistent understanding about how to go do that in an organization, because typically like big new cool technology is like government big projects, then big companies, then smaller companies and individuals. Shocker of this one is almost like whoop, the reverse. The capabilities are totally amazing at the individual level, then the departmental level, and so on. But we don't really have a great model for approaching that. The other areas that I think are great are that individuals and companies should be looking at next is not just the order optimization, but think of the other like big chunk of revenue, which is the RFP, customer contracts, customer agreements, and the more sophisticated and complex activities where I'm not pricing 10 lines, I'm pricing 1,000 or maybe even 10,000. That's a whole other beast. There's usually a different department, national accounts, strategic accounts, whatever. I think it's really good to start looking into that and where the opportunities are for automation, because that is if you think kind of orders are not done in the best way, I guarantee you RFP responses, it's even more manual, more time consuming and error prone. And a very little percentage of the time is spent on analysis. So I think that's a giant area to look into. So I kind of list that as my 3. And of actions, like get back into the information flow of conferences and podcasts to stay up to date on this. Because again, the market and the vendor landscape is moving extremely quickly. Like what we saw 6 months ago, totally different than what we're seeing today at the same show or at an equivalent type engagement. So really highly recommend meeting with peers and vendors on this to see where things are going.
Good advice, as always. And guys, we are at the end of the hour, but first, before we get out of here, let me just talk about 2 really good shows that are coming up. Coming up next week, the State of Customer Experience and Distribution, and our own Dr. Jonathan Bine will be leading that one, and that you will not want to miss. That will give us some great understanding of what's happening in the best practice studies. And then shortly after that, the State of Distributor Sales. So the next 2 programs from DSG are going to be talking about the most important things in distribution, sales, and customer experience. So guys, thank you. This was a great discussion. I'm sorry I missed it. I will not miss next year. Ian, I promise we did not schedule a vacation around the conference, so I will be at this next one, and I cannot wait to see you both live.
Well, can't wait too.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
See ya.